speaker says, I am a new man, while actually he is behaving like a dog. So he's saying one thing, I am a new man, and actually what has happened is he has turned into a dog. Now this mismatch is called irony. He is actually on his knees, licking the librarian's knees, snarls and barks at the librarian. The contrast between the human beings and the dog is symbolic one. Contrary to the humanist belief about literature as humanizing, humanist theory of literature says that literature has got a humanizing influence. The poet seems to indicate that its sorcerous power turns human being into primitive non-human being. This anti or non-humanist perception of art is characteristic of the postmodern literature. So the poem that we are reading is very typically postmodern, because it says that something, after reading poem, you don't become necessarily a better person, but probably you reach into your primitive source of your being and your existence, which unites you with the dog. So poetry becomes a transformative kind of effect on the reader. Now if you see the earlier poem, that poem is also about transformation, but it's in a different sense. A slumber did my spirit seal is about transformation of the speaker, who is transformed from an unknowing naive one who believes that his beloved will never die because he loves her so much, to somebody who is aware of the fact that she is already dead and she is one with nature. So this knowledge for the speaker brings about his transformation, while in this poem the speaker is transformed into a dog. So one of the very important aspects of poetry is transformation that takes place within the poem. So these are two very important poems that we have discussed, and we have seen some of the most basic characteristics of poetry. We have seen that it's made up of words used in a distinctive way. What is poetry made up of? Poetry is made up of language used artistically in a distinctive way as to increase its impact on the reader. How does poetry dance? Poetry dances because it does not reach anywhere. As Valerie says, it has no station to reach. It is just a journey. And so poetry is like dancing. Now what I am going to do is to give you certain tips about how to read and appreciate poetry, especially a poem that is unseen. So how will you read an unseen poem? Because every now and then you will come across an unseen poem in exams, or you might get an unseen poem in your life when somebody brings a poem to you. So how will you read it? What are the ways of reading the poem? So let me give you some basic tips about reading a poem. How to read and appreciate. Let's look at this slide. Though there is no one fixed way of reading poetry, here are some tips for analysis, comprehension and appreciation of poetry. The best way to do it is by asking questions as we go along reading. Better we get at asking questions about the poem, better we get at reading, analyzing and enjoying poetry. The skills of asking questions to poetry comes with a lot of practice and interest. So whenever you come across a new poem, you have to keep on asking questions to yourself as you go along reading a poem. And whatever questions that come to your mind, whatever observations that you make about the poem, you can jot them down on the margins with a pencil. So this is one way of reading poem. This is not the only way, obviously. So here are some tips about how will you read a poem. Obviously, when you get an unseen poem, first thing that you will notice is the title. Now title is not something that is put on the top of a poem. Title has got a very important function in a poem, and we have to ask ourselves, what is the function of title? What does title do? Very often title may lead you to the theme of the poem, the basic subject. Very often the title may mislead you. Very often the poets are ironic in their selection of title. For example, Eating Poetry is about transformation that takes place after you read a poem, has got an ironic element to it. Sometimes the title is oblique. It's not straight away. It doesn't lead you straight away to the theme or the subject of the poem. Sometimes the poem is untitled. It doesn't have many of Emily Dickinson's poems are untitled. In such cases, what editors of books often do is that they use the first line of the poem as the title, as in case of Wordsworth's poem, "A slumber did my spirit seal." So what is the first question that you will ask yourself? What does the title do? Now what will you do? The second question is you try to guess the character of the speaker. Who is speaking in this poem? This is the question, the second question that you will ask yourself. Who is speaking these lines? And you can gather information about him or her. The speaker in the poem, the first poem that we have seen, is the lover who has lost his beloved. And speaker in the second poem is the reader who relishes poetry. Now you will see that very often they may be very different from the real poets. So it's very important to keep in mind the character who is speaking, the speaker, the mask. This is the second tip. Ask yourself who is speaking. Try to identify the speaker. The third tip that I give is now you read poem carefully to find out the story or the plot of the poem by trying to guess what happens to speaker or some other characters. What is happening to people in the poem? The people may be the speaker. So this is the second question you ask. What is happening to people? In the first poem, what has happened to the speaker is that he was not knowing something and now he has realized that his beloved is not untouched by nature, but she has become one with nature. This realization that she is dead is what happens to the speaker. The next question that you can ask is what the speaker is saying and how is he or she saying it. So what and how are very important questions that you should ask. What is the speaker saying and how is he saying it? These are two very important questions that you should ask yourself when you read a unseen poem. The speaker in the first poem is awakened by the grief due to the death of his beloved. The characters of both speaker and his beloved are transformed. The lover realizes the mortality of his beloved, and the beloved is transformed from a living human being into spirit that is one with nature after death. The beloved is transformed from a human being into the spirit that is spirit of nature. In the second poem, the speaker is transformed into a dog to the librarian's horror. When you ask yourself how the speaker is saying, then in the second poem, the speaker is becoming ironic. He is very casual about the idea of his being transformed into a dog. The poem very closely resembles a very famous short story by a short story writer named Kafka. In Kafka's story called the Metamorphosis, one of the main characters in the story, Gregor Samsa, he wakes up and he finds that he has turned into a beetle. And the whole story is about him turning into beetle and what happens to him. And the whole story is told in a very matter of fact, very ordinary way, without making much fuss of him turning into a beetle. So the second poem resembles Kafka's short story. So what the speaker in the second poem seems to imply is that the poem is not a very safe thing. If you read it, you can go back to very dangerous areas of your life. After asking these questions, ask some other questions to the poem. Ask yourself, is it divided into stanzas? Are the stanzas regular? How many lines does each stanza consist of? Sometimes stanza may have 3 lines. It's called 3 lines regularly. It's called tercet, 3 line stanzas. It may have 4 line stanzas being repeated. It's called quartine. And you have to ask whether stanzas are regular or not. Let's look at the slide for some other questions. Does the poem have fixed metrical patterning? Many poems are written in a meter and rhyme. Many poems are not. The first poem is written in iambic pentameter. It's not pentameter, I'm sorry. It's 4 feet in first line, 3 feet in second line, which is very similar to ballad form. The second poem is written in the free verse format and it has got no fixed metrical pattern. The next question that you can ask is, what is the mood of the poem? The mood of the first poem is sad, serene, and philosophical. The mood of the second poem is absurd, comical, dark, and even sinister. Usually, the poems use words for creating emotional impact instead of communicating any information or message. Very often in poem, words are used for creating this kind of emotional impact and mood rather than giving you information about something. So this is how language of poetry differs in its intention from language of prose. As you go along reading a poem, making notes, asking yourself questions, jotting down your observations on the side with pencil or a pen, what you have to do is you have to ask some more questions like how effective the poet has been in creating this impact upon you. So you have to ask yourself, how effective is the poet? So what you have started doing is not just started analyzing or comprehending a poem, but you have also started evaluating it. And one of the values with which you evaluate a poem is how effective is the writer or the poet in doing what he is or she is doing. Then you go on asking yourself question, how does the poet use the figures of speech and other devices in the poem? Look at the images, metaphors and symbols in the poem. How well does the poet use irony? Irony, again I'm just recalling what I have said. Irony is mismatch between what is said and what is meant. It's very similar to what ancient Indian Sanskrit poeticians called Vakrokti, where there is a deviation between what is meant and what is said. There is a gap, there is a mismatch here. So irony is when you say one thing and what you mean is not exactly what you said, or it may in fact be absolutely opposite of what you said, as it happens in sarcasm. So there is a mismatch, and this mismatch is called irony. So how well has poet succeeded in creating this kind of indirect way of, oblique way of saying things? Let's look at the next question here. Please look at the slide. Yeah. Much of the impact of the poem on the reader depends on the freshness and preciseness or precision of the images, metaphors and symbols. Impact of a good poem is that it has got a very sharp, precise way of describing things in terms of images. Very often the images are very fresh, the images that you have never heard of or read about, and this freshness is what makes a poem very attractive one. There is no such thing like good poem or a bad poem. There is something like stale poem and a fresh poem. And fresh and stale obviously are relative words. So today what is fresh may become stale tomorrow. Or there might be certain forms of freshness in a poem which remain fresh over ages. And one example that comes to your mind is metaphysical poetry, whose images and symbols have remained fresh for centuries. Ask yourself if the poet's use of figurative language is effective and interesting. So these are the questions that you have to ask yourself, and all this comes with practice. Let's look at the next step. Very often, tracing the abstract nouns can lead reader to the theme of the poem or the subject of the poetry. And the use of abstract noun like spirit, earthly, force in Wordsworth poem, or the abstract noun like happiness, poetry, new man in the Strand poem indicate the theme of the poem. So it's a good idea to look at the abstract nouns in the poem, and very often consider the fact that both the poets use these words ironically, though in a different way. So word spirit is not used in the same way as people do. It's used in a different way, and this different way of using the same word is what poetry is about. Poetry renews the language, it extends the possibilities of language, it uses same words in a different way. And irony is one way of doing that. Look at the words like new man, and it becomes ironic here. New man, in a traditional conventional way of saying new man, is different from the way in which Mark Strand uses the word new man. For him, new man is none other than dog. I want to end my discussion by giving you certain names of books which you might find useful for appreciating poetry. And these are very popular books. Have a look. The first book is Clint Brooks and Robert Penn Warren's Understanding Poetry, which appeared in 1976. It's something like a textbook for comprehension of poetry. More recent one is Edward Hirsch, How to Read a Poem and Fall in Love with Poetry, which appeared in 2000. Another very interesting book is Harold Bloom, The Art of Reading Poetry, which appeared in 2005. And more recent one is Terry Eagleton's How to Read a Poem, which appeared in 2007. So these 4 books are very useful for you to understand how poem works, how poetry works. So we started out with trying to figure out what poetry is and why is it important. And I said it's important because it's everywhere. Our sacred books, it's in film songs, it's in titles of the serials, it's everywhere. And we also found out that poetry is one of the ways in which culture reproduces and produces itself, and that's why we study it. Then we started thinking about how does poem work. Then I said the poem works by dancing. It works in a different way than the prose works. I also began by asking what is poetry, by looking into the etymological definition of poetry, and I said that word poetry comes from poenin, which is to make. So poetry is something which is made or crafted.